As you know, State Parks recently announced the intent to revisit the LA State Historic Parks General Plan to consider the LA Aerial Regional Transit Project. We're in our first round of outreach and really do appreciate folks taking the time to participate in our planning process by providing input on the potential considerations the project may have on the park property and its operations. Again, I just wanted to welcome and thank you for supporting the park and taking the time to join us this evening, and we'll turn it back over to Jessica. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Alex. I see a note from one of the participants about accessing the interpretation. You're either going to look for the globe icon or the 3 dots and more on your Zoom screen, but someone on our team will message you to get you help with that, with the interpretation. Okay, so let's move on to the purpose of the meeting. The purpose of the meeting is to provide an overview of the general plan amendment process and the Los Angeles Aerial Rapid Transit Project, and to gather input regarding potential issues and opportunities for consideration during the general plan amendment process. Moving on to the agenda. First, State Parks will provide an overview of the Los Angeles State Historic Park General Plan Amendment. Next, we'll provide an overview of the LA Aerial Rapid Transit Project. Then we'll provide a summary of previous environmental and approval processes. And next, we'll review the LA Aerial Rapid Transit Project's existing commitments to the park. And then we'll have a public input session, which is really focused on considerations relative to the general plan amendment. And finally, we'll conclude by covering next steps. When we do get to the public input session, you can provide your input tonight using the Zoom chat feature. After the meeting, you can also provide input online at the website. It's lastatehistoricparkgpa.com, and that's in the chat for you, via email at lastatehistoricparkgpa@parks.ca.gov, and via regular mail. And the feedback that State Parks receives by December 15th will be considered as the draft general plan amendment options are developed. But it's important to note that State Parks will be collecting feedback from the public throughout the amendment process. And the next slide gives you a preview of the types of input that we'll be looking for in the public input session later in the meeting. I won't read through the whole slide now, but we did want to just pull it up for a moment to give you a chance to take a look at it in case it sparks any ideas. And I'll read out some select information for the benefit of those that are listening via interpretation to give you a bit of a preview. So during the public input session, we'll be looking for any ideas or suggestions you'd like the team to consider as the general plan amendment is developed. And in particular, we're looking for your input on a number of topics. Some examples include park amenities. So examples of that would be concessions or restrooms, park infrastructure and enhancements. So that might be trash receptacles, lighting, or signage, access, and some examples there are park hours or disabled access, and also programming and coordination with special events, construction impacts. And we'd also like to know if there are any other topics you'd like to see the team consider as the general plan amendment as the general plan amendment is developed. And Alex will now provide an overview of the general plan amendment process.
Thank you, Jessica. Go ahead and move to the next slide. So before I start going through the general plan amendment process, I wanted to take a minute to talk about LA State Historic Park. As many of you are already familiar, this park unit is about 32 acres. It's in the heart of downtown Los Angeles. And through the collaborative efforts of the department, local residents, and communities, was identified as essential to retain open space in the densely developed area. Additionally, the property has cultural and historical significance. And the current general plan was finalized in the early 2000s, and and was quickly developed. Most of the park was quickly developed to meet the public's needs. It currently provides open space areas for daily activities, walking trails, and hosts various special events and community festivals throughout the year. Next slide, please. Additionally, I want to talk to you a little bit clarification of what a general plan is. as a vision document for our park units. They establish conceptual goals and guidelines for the long-term development, management, and operations of the property. General plans also identify the type of facilities and activities that would be appropriate for the park and the public, and for the public's future use and enjoyment of the property. Next slide, please. All right, so getting down to the actual general plan amendment process. Initially, when we have a proposal for a project, the first step we like to take is make sure that it's consistent. We evaluate it against the current general plan and look for consistency. When we did look at this project, we did not find it consistent with the general plan, and that's why we've decided to move through this amendment process to evaluate whether or not this project would be feasible within the park unit. Just to clarify, we'll be calling it a general plan amendment process, but depending on the type of recommendations we make, should we make at the end of the process, it could either be an update or a revision, depending on the amount of changes that might be required. So right now, we'll call it an amendment process to keep it simple, but at the end of the day, it could be an update or a revision, depending on what the recommendation might be. So once we decided to work through an amendment process, we then start gathering data and looking at any background documentation we have on the property, any regulation or legal obligations associated with the property, as well as past planning efforts. And we also like to gather, and this is when we also like to gather public input on the potential benefits or considerations around the park unit. We compile, once we've gathered that input, we then compile that and analyze that info and that we've received, and then we develop some options. And then we bring those options back out to the public and our stakeholders for further review and refinement. Once we've taken that back out to the public and we've gotten that further review, we then reconsider the options that were developed and come up with that final recommendation that we prepare the draft general plan around. That draft general plan is then released back out to the public for review again, as well as supplied to the State Park and Rec Commission, who then has the final authority on taking action on the general plan. And that would be, the goal is to have that meeting in September of next year for the State Park and Rec Commission to take action on this effort. Next slide, please. So as I stated, there's quite a few opportunities for public input. And right now we're doing that first round where we're scoping and we're looking at any potential benefits, issues, considerations around the park unit that this project might have. We will then be compiling that information, and hopefully what we would like to do is get any input that you might have or feedback by December 15th, so that we can then start developing those options, which we'd like to bring back to you in the new year, around February. For refinement. Of course, we continue to take feedback and input throughout the process, but if we could get any information by the 15th, we then can take it into December 15th, we can then take it into consideration as we're developing our options. We will then be back out with those options to share with our stakeholders and the public for further review in February of 2025. We'll go back and make any necessary adjustments for the draft general plan, and then we will release that in early summer of 2025 for review and submission to the Park and Rec Commission for their action in September of 2025, or the fall of 2025. Next slide, please. All right, so even though we're in this process with the general plan amendment, it's not the final steps. We still have plenty of other approvals and agreements that need to be clarified. And some of those include the right of entry for construction of the LA station in the park. That will also address park operations during construction, including maintaining park access, security, and the coordination with special events. We'll also have to define some real property agreements for the station in the park, for the aerial rights requirements over the park as well. And then, of course, there's going to be operational agreements. And some of these operational changes will also be clarified in the general plan. But these agreements will address the Los Angeles Aerial Regional Transit and Park day-to-day operations, including park access and hours of operation, security, programming, and coordination with park operations and special events. So with that, I will now turn it over to Barry Molina, with the project manager for AECOM.
Thank you, Alex. So Los Angeles Aerial Rapid Transit Technologies, LLC, is owned by Zero Emissions Transit, a California nonprofit benefit corporation, and they're proposing the Los Angeles Aerial Rapid Transit Project. ZET's focus is on the impact of greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector, and its mission is to identify, support, facilitate, and implement zero-emission transportation initiatives and other projects that will hasten climate change mitigation and resiliency. So the Los Angeles Aerial Rapid Transit would connect Los Angeles Union Station to Dodger Stadium and Elysian Park via an aerial gondola system. The project includes an intermediate station at the southernmost entrance of the State Historic Park, and it provides an aerial rapid transit option for visitors to Dodger Stadium, while also providing access between Dodger Stadium property, the surrounding communities, including El Pueblo, Chinatown, and others. The project would also provide pedestrian improvements, including hardscapes and landscape improvements along the project alignment, as well as amenities in the park. The project would operate daily, serving residents, workers, park users, and visitors to Los Angeles. Next slide, please. Comments received during the scoping process led to the addition of an intermediate station. The location of that station was determined to be the least impacting alternative for the LA Art station, and that station's actually designed to create a stronger connection between the park and Metro's Blue Line. The station proposes to enhance transit access to Chinatown, the park, the Los Angeles River, and nearby neighborhoods. Next slide, please. The Chinatown State Park station would be integrated into the southernmost entrance of the LA State Park, and the information on its aerial extent is provided on this slide. These slides are also available on the State Park's website. Next slide. The proposed alignment crosses over the westernmost edge of this park, adjacent to the existing Metro A line or Blue Line. Next slide, please. Next slide after that. So in February of 2024, the Los Angeles County Metropolitan Transportation Authority, as the lead agency, approved the project pursuant to public code and certified the environmental impact report in accordance with CEQA. State Parks, as a responsible agency under CEQA, was consulted during the preparation of the draft and final EIRs. The subject matter relevant to the park is presented below and was considered in the EIR. Next slide, please. As a responsible agency, state parks will rely on the information contained in the EIR for consideration of whether to mitigate, approve, or disapprove the requested actions for the general plan amendment and the project within its regulatory jurisdiction. As set forth in the EIR, there's a mitigation measure LUP-A, and it would be implemented to require the project to obtain a park general plan amendment. The general plan amendment is subject to the review and approval of the State Park and Recreation Commission, which retains its independent authority related to the project. Otherwise, the EIR concluded that the operational environmental impacts related to the park were less than significant. Next slide, please. So during the EIR process, there was an initial 45-day scoping period that was from October 1st to November 16th, 2020, where Metro held a virtual scoping meeting to receive comments, concerns, and issues to be considered in the draft EIR. During the draft EIR was released in October 17th, 2022 for an initial 60-day period that was extended to a total of 90 days and proceeded from October 17th through 2022 through January 17th, 2023. During that review period, there were 8 public meetings that were conducted by Metro. They were before, during, and immediately after the draft EIR. Those meeting materials were translated into English, Spanish, traditional Chinese, and simplified Chinese. An interpretation at the meetings was provided in Spanish, Mandarin, and Cantonese. At all 8 public meetings, an interpretation was also provided in Taishanese at the final 2 public meetings. There was also ADA accommodations that were made as well. Comments from the draft EIR could be submitted in writing, by phone, and during the 4 public hearings. All of the comments that were received were responded to as part of the final EIR. Next slide, please. Following the close of the draft EIR public review period in the spring, summer, fall of 2023, Metro continued to coordinate with responsible agencies, trustee agencies, interested parties, and other stakeholders. Metro hosted 2 pre-final EIR release public meetings to provide additional updates. The final EIR was released on December 4th, 2023. And in February of 2024, the Metro Board considered certification of the EIR, the final EIR. Next slide, please. Next slide. Some commitments to the park that are associated with the project we are speaking of today. To facilitate transportation connectivity, the project would include pedestrian access enhancements that include active transportation amenities, including shade structures, potential seating, and consistency with the Connect USA action plan. There's also plans for a mobility hub at the Chinatown State Park Station, where passengers would be able to access a suite of first last mile multimodal options, such as bike share programs. In addition, the Chinatown State Park Station would include the installation of landscaping and hardscaping, and it's designed to integrate rather than remove the existing historic granite pavers into the design. The station would also include park amenities, including additional 740 square feet of concessions, 770 square feet of restrooms, and a covered breezeway connecting the concessions and restrooms. Finally, the project design will be inspired by adjacent neighborhood culture and history. Each project component will be designed to complement and reflect the unique character of the surrounding area and will be discussed with identified stakeholder groups. The project would create numerous opportunities to collaborate with and showcase local artists, along with identification of sites along the alignment. The goal of the interpretation plan is to develop a program that would provide all riders with an engaging and informative experience, enhancing their understanding and appreciation of the culture and history of the adjacent neighborhoods. And finally, the project would create a business and community support program to assist local businesses financially affected by the proposed project construction activities. The EIR included environmental clearance for the park's planned pedestrian and bicycle bridge. That bridge is needed to provide access across the Metro A line or Blue Line and a steep grade change that happens from the park from North Broadway. That That pedestrian bridge is currently unfunded, but it would provide ADA accessible pedestrian and bicycle bridge access to the park. The new bridge would create more connections between the park and areas of Chinatown, Cathedral High School, and Solana Canyon. The lack of transportation is routinely the number one or number two barrier to accessing public parks in the Los Angeles region. As a result of this, the Los Angeles County Metropolitan Transportation Authority developed the Transit to Parks Strategic Plan to improve public transportation access to parks and open spaces throughout the region. This plan is aimed at addressing equity issues by helping underserved communities reach parks and outdoor areas via public transit. Next slide, please. This project would enhance community connectivity by providing first and last mile transit pedestrian access to the area that has historically been underserved, including the park and Elysian Park. The project would include a mobility hub at Dodger Stadium property to provide connectivity to Elysian Park, Solana Canyon, and the surrounding communities.
Okay, thanks, Barry. We're going to move into the public input session. As I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, you can provide your input tonight using the Zoom chat feature. And after the meeting, you can also provide input online at lastatehistoricparkgpa.com, via email at lastatehistoricparkgpa@parks.ca.gov, and via regular mail. The feedback State Parks receives by December 15th will be considered as the draft general plan amendment options are developed. And we also noted that State Parks will be collecting feedback from the public throughout the general plan amendment process. We're going to stay on this slide for just a moment in case anyone wants to take a screenshot of that information, if you haven't pulled it out of the chat itself. So we'll stay here for just a second. You can also get these links out of the chat. Okay. So let's go ahead and move into the input session. So feel free to drop your input into the Zoom chat. I see a number of notes have come in already. I'm going to read through this slide for the benefit of those that are participating via the interpretation feature. So during the input session, we're looking for whether you have ideas or suggestions you'd like the team to consider as the general plan amendment is developed. And in particular, any considerations related to the park operations, visitor experience, etc. So we want to be keeping that in mind as you frame your input here. But we are looking for feedback on topics such as improvements between the Metro A line or Blue Line station and the park. And examples there are shade structures and seating. I'm going to go ahead and read through all of these for interpretation, but you can feel free to go ahead and drop your feedback into the chat as I'm going through this. And I see a number of notes coming in, so thank you. Mobility hub, so first and last mile multimodal options such as a bike share program, park amenities, and some examples there would be concessions or restrooms, park infrastructure and enhancements, so trash receptacles, lighting, signage, etc. Chinatown State Park station design, station artwork including utilization of local artists, access, for example, park hours or disabled access, and then interpretation and education opportunities, hardscape and landscape improvements at the park entrance. So examples there are integration of historic pavers and trees and other landscape plantings, the park pedestrian and bicycle bridge, additional opportunities for park access, programming and coordination for special events, construction impacts, and then also thinking a little bit more broadly, are there any other topics you'd like the team to consider relative to the park operations, park visitor experience as the general plan amendment is developed? And I know that we had a handful of questions come in related to kind of general plan process and amendment process that I think, Alex, you were going to try to address as we get started here.
Yes, thank you, Jessica. I was keeping track of a lot of the great comments coming through the chat, and so I did catch a few questions, and I'll continue to scroll through and see if I can get some more. But the first one that I saw was the GPA is a done deal. The general plan amendment sounds like it's a done deal. It is not. We are in the process of reviewing this project as it would relate to the park unit. In order to do that, we would have to assume that the project was in the park unit. So as we move through this process, we're going to be looking at whether or not it's feasible for this project to be in the park and how would it be feasible. That would mean that at the end of the day, either we would have an amendment in place or we will decide that it's not feasible and we would not move forward with an amendment. The difference, another question that came in was the clarification on the difference between an amendment and an update to the GP. So an update to a GP usually is something minor, minor things that we might want to clarify in a general plan, but we feel it doesn't change the intent, vision, or operations of the general plan. I don't believe that this would be an update. It would likely be an amendment or a revision. And a revision is when there's larger changes to a general plan and the intent of the property and the services that the property provides, whereas an amendment is kind of that middle ground. So we don't really know at this point, because we're still getting that data and that input from folks, to what level the recommended changes, if there are any, would be to the general plan. But once we do get to that point, probably in the spring, we will have a better idea of if this is feasible and to what extent the plan would have to be updated or revised in order to make it feasible. I think I already addressed that this is confusing, as it sounds like the gondola is already assumed. Like I said, it's not assumed that it's going to be there, but in order to do this evaluation, we have to move forward as if the gondola was in the park so we can evaluate what those effects might be. Let's see, what was another one? Another question was, will we be gathering information about what would be losses or risks to the park in regards to the gondola? Yes. We want to hear from you not only what you think the benefits might be or opportunities might be, but if there is additional concerns, risks, or losses that you're concerned about. So would like to hear both your feelings on some of the most negative or positive side of this project within the park unit. While we're going through this process, it's helpful for us to get details from you on what you think this project might mean for this property. You know, it's very hard to move forward in a planning process when we just get I support or I don't support. We like to know, why are you supportive of this or why you are not? Give us some details, and definitely like to hear folks who are looking and thinking about how this comes to play both in the positive and the negative light, right? So we want to hear both sides of that for sure. There was another question about who will be responsible for operating and maintaining the gondola. Is it the city or private company? That's part of what's going to have to be discussed during over this next year during this general plan amendment process, as well as into the future should it move forward. That is still the operating agreements, and the operation of the facility is still something that has to be discussed and decided upon. So we don't know that yet. Let me see if I see any others. I'm going to continue to scroll through this, Jessica, if there's anything you wanted to cover while I was going through these comments.
Yeah, somebody else had a note about, would it be possible to update the language on the input form to make it clear that the general plan amendment is not yet approved? So yeah, we can certainly do that. Definitely. To clarify that. That we're at the early stages of the general plan amendment process and collecting input relative to considerations for the park as part of the general plan amendment process.
Yeah, and then this amendment, should it move forward, it goes to the State Park and Rec Commission, and they are the authority on our approvals of our general plans and the amendments and revisions. So it's really going to be up to them to, once we bring our recommendation to that body, they're the ones who have the authority to approve these documents for our park units. And so I just want to make it clear that not only is there opportunity in these conversations with us to share your feedback, but there's also opportunity at the commission meetings, and there'll be 3 or 4 of them before should this process make its way in the fall. There'll be a few more meetings before that, so you can always take the time to join one of our commission meetings. There'll be one in February, there'll be one in March, and one in June. You're welcome to check out the commission's webpage, which we can put in the chat for those the schedule of those dates, and sign up for being updated. But you can always join those meetings and leave comment to the commission during their agenda item for comment period for items not on the agenda. So that's also another opportunity for you to share your input with the commission before the amendment, should it be finalized, moves to them for action.
Yeah, I see a number of comments coming through relative to support for the project and opposition to the project, and questions about how the project relates to the general plan process itself. And so, you know, Alex, I think that if people have feedback one way or another in terms of considerations, pros, cons, concerns, that they should be providing that feedback both in the chat and through those other methods that we mentioned. And State Parks will be reviewing the full record of input received as you start developing the general plan draft options in the early part of the next year. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay.
Jessica, there's a question about the aerial extent of the project over the park, and we have a slide for that I skipped over probably more quicker than I should have. Can we go back to that? And I'm happy to. Yeah, here we go. This is good. So for the folks that were curious as to the aerial extent of the affected area, you can see that it is the westernmost portion of the park, and the station is down there in, I guess you would call that the sort of the southwest corner. And if we go to the slide before this, I think it talks about the station aerial footprint. So there's the footprint of the station itself as it would affect the park, and the total overhang as well. So that's the station aspect. And then the following slide is the aerial pathway. You can kind of see what that looks like, and recognize that the gondola will be above the park and not on the park itself. And these slides, like I said, these slides are available on the State Parks website if you want to have copies of them.
So I have a couple other questions. First, I wanted just to also clarify that one of the reasons why we wanted to give you this information about the LA Art project is so that when you are giving us feedback and input, you've got, you know, some good idea of the specifics around the project as it can impact the park. But there was another question: is there any other state park which has gone through this process and has ceded aerial rights? The only other park that I can think of where this is similar would be the gondola in San Jacinto. There's a gondola that goes down from Palm Springs that brings people up to the park. And that effort was done many, many, many years ago, and I'm sure was very different in the scope at that time. But right now, that's the only one I can think of when we're talking about aerial rights, when besides what we already have to abide by when it comes to, of course, use of planes and drones and those types of things. I apologize as I'm scrolling through. I don't know if Jessica, you saw any questions that you might want me to.
I'm scrolling through as well. You know, there's a lot of feedback in the chat. A lot of it focused on either support or opposition to the project. I'm looking for feedback relative to the general plan amendment process. Covered a few of them.
Jessica, there's some questions about the tree removal in the park,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know whether Alex wants to address that, or I mean the specific number of trees to be removed and then replaced, because there is a tree replacement plan, is outlined in the EIR.
There is a tree replacement plan outlined in the EIR. However, we would want to relook at that plan as from the state park side to see what would actually be feasible in the park unit, and where that would make sense for the trees. Should this move forward, where would that make sense? So that's something that we'll also be looking at through this process. Is some of those concessions that were part of the EIR will also be evaluating as we feel it would actually look on the ground in the park unit.
So there are a couple of notes here. One's a question noting that access to the park is currently free. So how would the project impact access to the park? And then there's another note about infrastructure that I can convey as well. Go ahead.
As for the access to the park, the operations of the gondola and those type of specifics, that has not been discussed or decided upon, and we would be discussing that as we move through this process to see what is feasible. When it comes to the actual general access to the park, there's no intent for that to change. People would still be able to access this park as they do now, of course, depending on things like special events or other things happening in the area, which sometimes does close off sections of the park. But there's no intent to limit access to the park.
Yeah, and there's a couple of notes indicating that folks are hoping that the project would coordinate to ensure sufficient trash receptacles and lighting and no impacts there to the park. And then another note related to wayfinding and infrastructure. Someone provided some feedback that they'd love to see signage at the stations directing people that use the gondola to know where the major sightseeing activities are at. And keeping the area well lit and safe is also important. Security guards that monitor not only the gondola, but a portion of the surrounding areas. So we're getting some feedback relative to some of those items.
And then I think there was a question about the focus of the general plan amendment and why we're considering this project. Of course, this project went for a few years planning. It went to the board, the transportation board. They did approve it. And so once that happened, the next step for them was asking the department to evaluate the feasibility of this project in the park unit, is what we're doing now. And I think that personally, with all the effort that has happened around this park and with the community and the support of this park, that we should do our due diligence and evaluate whether or not this project is feasible. And so we are focusing this effort on the project. However, if there are other items about the park that you think should be also reviewed, please feel free to send us, feedback or, information about that as well. We'd like to hear those comments as well. And like I mentioned, we are everything you guys are here putting in the chat and what we receive through the other means of providing input, we will be compiling. And when we come back out, we will be addressing what we've heard and how that was evaluated. So definitely, happy to hear other issues, benefits, improvements that you think should be considered as well.
Yeah, we have some feedback too on with regards to local artist installations or an artwork or murals at the state park station should be reflective of the history of the park. Another individual noted concern about the visual impact and that the park is an important view corridor. And so wanting to make sure that that gets taken into account during the general plan amendment process. Let's see.
Are there any others about this process?
I think you answered most of the questions about process.
There were quite a few, so if someone feels like there was something about the process that we captured, please go ahead and repaste it back into the chat so we can. Address it. And again, hopefully you guys, really appreciate you joining us this evening. I know it's 6 o'clock on a Tuesday, so thank you for being here with us. So I have a question about how long do these processes typically take? That less than a year seems very fast. I would agree with you. A year is very fast for us. However, we're building on a lot of the process that was already done by the project itself. So they've been working on this, like I said, for a few years. They already did an EIR, which has so far been approved. And so we're building on that when we're doing this evaluation. So what we're looking at now is the different types of aspects that we would at state parks evaluate for our properties that don't typically get captured in CEQA because they're not legally required, but we like to look at those when we do our general plans and review projects. And that would include things like impacts to the visitors, like many of you are already sharing with us today. That's not legally necessary to be evaluated in the CEQA process, but we like to evaluate that in our park planning processes. So we're looking at a year, which yes, is fast, but because there's been so much work, we only have to focus on this project as it might impact the park itself. Feel that we can do that assessment in a timely manner. Also wanting to make sure that, because there's so much passion around this project, we would like to settle the matter sooner than later. We don't really want to drag it out. So we are committed to trying to get this done sooner than later. When I have a question about out of the general plan amendment options developed, will a no project be an option explored and presented? We will have that as an option, but we don't really need to explore it, present it, because we know what the park looks like without this project already. So there will be that no option, but and folks are of course going to be able to remark on that, but we don't really need to do much research around that because we already know how this park functions. So we'll really be assessing any changes in the park that this might result in and whether or not they're feasible to move forward with, any amendment for the park.
Okay, so there are a number of notes coming in, both in opposition and support of the project. So as we mentioned, State Parks will have the full record of the notes that have been submitted tonight, and those will be reviewed in conjunction with all of the other feedback that's collected through December 15th as part of the development of the initial general plan, draft general plan options. Okay. We're just getting close to time to wrap up. I'm just looking through to see if there are any more process-related questions or feedback with respect to the general plan amendment. We got some additional good feedback on the potential for bike facilities and trail maintenance to be considered as part of the general plan amendment, and native plantings and protection of green space and habitat, and some additional feedback related to artwork. Great. Okay. All right. Well, we're nearing 7 o'clock, so we should probably get ready to wrap up here. Alex, were there any other questions you wanted to cover before we move into wrap up? I think we got most of the process-related questions and reported back on some of the general plan amendment feedback that we got.
I think the other one I just saw was how many more meetings will be needed for a final decision. There's going to be quite a few, Mary. Not only will we be coming back to the public with information that we've gathered, but we're also going to be meeting with many of our stakeholders for this park unit, and that's both internal stakeholders as well as external stakeholders. So there'll be quite a few meetings being held around this conversations. Then, of course, then there's always the discussions that have to happen when it moves up the chain through agency and above, and then, of course, through the commission. So there is a lot of discussion that will happen around this project as we move forward. And like I said, there'll be the opportunity for the public again in the fall, in the early, in February and early in the new year, I'm sorry, in the spring, late spring, as well as the fall.
Okay, great, thank you. So that kind of ties into the next steps. So let's take a look. As we've talked about and Alex just reviewed, state parks will be reviewing the public input collected during this initial project initiation phase as the general plan amendment options are developed. And as Alex said, those will be presented for feedback early next year for review and consideration. And then the draft general plan amendment is prepared and available for public review and feedback. And finally, as Alex mentioned, the final draft general plan amendment would be presented to the State Park and Rec Commission for consideration. And in terms of staying involved, want to make sure that you all have the project website. Just flipping over to the next slide, which is lastatehistoricparkgpa.com. And you can sign up for the email list so that you receive notifications of future meetings as we move into early next year. Okay. So we'll go ahead and thank you for your participation in this evening's meeting. Appreciate you coming out. And for those of you that were there on Saturday, appreciate your time as well. And with that, we'll go ahead and conclude the meeting. So thank you, everyone, and good night.